Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, we are here with Jacob Tsypkin from, actually, let me just check on that. Is that the correct way to pronounce your name?
That is the correct way to pronounce my name.
Okay, nice. Nailed it.
Nailed it.
Yeah, cool. All right, we are here with Jacob Tsypkin of Anarchos Training Methods. And Jacob has a lot of background coaching CrossFit competitors. He has coached some people, at the elite level, up and down the stack of elite performance. Founded CrossFit Monterey way back in the day. Longtime CrossFit content producer, although not much of a marketer of his CrossFit content. So, if you know where to dig, you can find some pretty great stuff. We'll link to a bunch of your blog articles in the show notes as well. And Jacob currently does a lot of remote coaching, works with some competitive fitness athletes, works with some general population folks and tries to help them, feel good, have fun, move well, works with jiu-jitsu folks such as Luke, right? Rolling around on the ground, pulling on each other's clothes, flipping each other over, twisting arms, all that kind of stuff. And Jacob has a very thoughtful, philosophical approach to training, which we appreciate. So to kick things off, Jacob, let's go with a very high level question full of abstraction to allow you to, opine philosophically on your training beliefs.
Perfect.
Yeah, right. This is what we live for. This is why people listen to this podcast. When you are coaching a CrossFit competitor, you have a challenge. The challenge is that the sport demands a wide variety of capabilities. It demands the ability to adapt on the fly to new things being thrown at you. It demands the ability to kind of handle a bunch of crazy shit that purposefully doesn't make sense. Simultaneously, when you are coaching someone, you need to actually set things up so that they can get better, which requires repetition, progression, whatever. These are seemingly competing, right? How do we give someone chaos all the time while also allowing them to progress in a way that actually makes sense from a coaching perspective? What do we do? Philosophize for us.
So I think you framed the problem pretty well there. The core problem is CrossFit is a sport defined by variance. But at the same time, it seems clear from what we know about adaptation and training that you need repetition, you need practice in order to make progress over an extended period of time. You need enough sameness in your training that you can get better at things. So I think the key is determining what are sort of the core adaptations that are going to carry over the most, what is going to what A is going to have strong carryover to B, C, and D, and emphasizing those things up to the point of diminishing returns. And it's also important to recognize where the point of diminishing returns is and where an athlete needs to step away from those more conventional training methods, from the focus on getting stronger, improving, what is typically called aerobic capacity or whatever, broadly defined adaptation you want to pick. And to try to make those adaptations specific. And that transition can happen at a few different points, I think at a few different levels of analysis. But the two big ones are you need to know when you should change an athlete's training towards variance, towards the sort of ironic non-specific specificity of the sport of CrossFit, both in terms of their career as an athlete. When does an athlete no longer need to focus on putting those extra 10 pounds on their back squat? And also in terms of the season, at what point when preparing for a competition is it time to say, we've got all we're going to get out of this kind of more isolated approach to training, trying to develop all these qualities independently of one another or relatively independently of one another, and try to integrate them. And I think knowing how to do that and when to do that is the core challenge.
Yeah, so I think that you're touching on something that we've discussed a few times in various previous episodes, right? Is that you have this transferability challenge where, like you mentioned, theoretically, if you can just add 10 pounds to your back squat, like who wouldn't want to do that? But there's a cost to adding 10 pounds to your back squat. When do you know that adding 10 pounds to your back squat is actually the thing that you should be focusing on? right? And I think that most of us who have coached people in the sport of CrossFit have seen things not translate that we would expect to translate. You're like, okay, yeah, like you struggle with chest to bar pull-ups. Maybe you want to improve your upper body pulling strength. Maybe you want to improve your max set of unbroken chest to bar. Maybe you want to improve your ability to do chest to bar on the minute. And like we can see all these things go up, and then you get whatever thruster, double under, chest to bar, like whatever combo in the open. And it's like, you still suck at chest to bar, even though every single metric associated with this that we improved in training got better. What happened? So like, how do you think about figuring out what does transfer and what doesn't transfer?
Yeah, that's really complicated, especially because, as I'm sure you guys have observed, sometimes something will transfer for a particular athlete and not for another. The approach I have come to is basically to quote my good friend Mike Tuchscherer, follow athlete response. I think that the way that I think about training design in general is that the program is not just a prescription for the athlete, it's also an information processor for me. So I think the key from an organizational perspective is to figure out, what can I test? How can I integrate, regular... I dislike the word testing because I think it gives the idea of like, we're testing your fitness. What we're trying to do with regular testing is to see whether you are progressing. And I think, somewhat ironically, somewhat counterintuitively, that requires a lot of repetition, even within the domain of highly varied CrossFit training. As for, but for figuring out transference, I think we can make some broad claims. If we stay away from too much granularity, it's pretty likely putting 50 pounds on your back squat is going to drive your squat clean up. So when we're looking at a transfer in kind of isolated capacities, so your legs getting stronger will increase your maximum squat clean, almost assuredly, as long as they get significantly stronger. It gets a lot more complicated when we look at what we might call integrated capacity, your capacities across all these different, fitness domains when they're put together. That gets a lot more difficult. And I think the only sensible approach really is to directly test those kinds of capacities. So that means, on the large scale, I think you look at things like open workouts because they are obviously, to the extent you have them, to higher level competition workouts, but we'll just say competition workouts. You look at competition workouts because they are a reliable indicator. We know that they are the sport, and because they allow you to compare to a bunch of other athletes. So you're not just looking at your own numbers. But within the context of training, the way that I like to do it is to repeat the same workouts a lot, as Luke can attest to. We do the same training repeatedly. I think that there's a sort of a confusion about variance that is the idea that it means your training has to be varied every single day, every single week. I think that's a mistake. I think you can include sufficient variance to encompass the sport of CrossFit in a microcycle of, generally I go with 2 weeks, right? A 2-week microcycle for CrossFitters, I think is about right. I think you can include enough variance in that by just having a bunch of different workouts that you can repeat the workouts, make progress, and you have to use that progress as your indicator. There's no the best indication of transfer is just watching progress happen, and then over a long period of time, tracking what works for the athlete, what seems to make improvements, testing it against some kind of external metric like an open workout or similar, and going from there. I also do think it's really important, I think the concept of diminishing marginal returns is very, very valuable for a CrossFit coach specifically. You have to know, and this is something I've struggled with in the past, you have to know when it's time to say, this athlete is not going to get stronger at a cost that is acceptable. And I'm picking on strength here because it's something people get honed in on. It could be any physical capacity, but you have to know when to say, this athlete will not get stronger at a cost that is acceptable to their overall fitness. And at that point, you have to understand the purpose of their strength training or whatever it is changes. At that point, their strength training is like, hey, let's make sure you're as strong as possible on game day, but taking your, as a male athlete aiming at the CrossFit Games, taking your deadlift from 400 to 450, pretty valuable, probably worth it, unless you're really, really, really struggling to get your deadlift up, and it's like you have to direct all your training at it. Getting your deadlift from 450 to 500, from 500 to 525. Obviously, there's genetic factors here as well, but the better you are at something, the more it costs to continue to get better at it. And all training is about resource management, but CrossFit training is especially about resource management. You've only got so much time, both kind of in the scale of preparation for a single competition and in terms of your career. You have to know when to say, we need to put this domain, this domain of fitness, I don't want to say on the back burner, but you have to understand when it is, it's close to as good as it's going to get, and you're going to get much more payoff focusing your training on something else.
So how would you feel that relates to, take someone like Sam Briggs, who, perennial games athlete, obviously lacking on top end strength, and always struggles in the heavier events or the max lift kind of things. For someone like her, I would look at her and say, okay, yeah, it would be great if you could get stronger, but for you to get stronger, we might sacrifice everything that's actually keeping you returning to the games. The engine, the high volume work. Do you think for someone like her, spending that time basically making her strength that much better is more valuable than trying to get her, actual strength level higher?
Well, so I'll talk about sort of an athlete in that I don't want to speak about Sam specifically because I don't know the specifics of her situation, but in general, what's interesting about CrossFit is that there's as of now, there's a fairly broad range of, like, we could call them fitness profiles that CrossFit games level athletes have, with the exception of the top people, the people who are like consistently, let's say top 10, maybe even top 5. You can see kind of different profiles of strengths and weaknesses. That's part of what's interesting about the sport, is that, you're going to show up. If you get to the games, there's like 13 or so scored events typically, and they really are pretty different. So you can have athletes who have different strengths and weaknesses perform, admirably. But of course, at the very top, you look at people like CrossFit Games champions, they just don't have any weaknesses. So in a case like what you're talking about, where you have somebody who has this incredibly high level of fitness in a particular domain and is lacking elsewhere, assuming it is the case that they have hit that point of diminishing returns, which I suspect is, I don't think Sam Briggs struggles with top end strength because she hasn't tried really hard with excellent coaching and programming to get stronger. There's a genetic limit. So in that kind of case, yeah, I think what you're saying is correct. You've got to recognize you keep getting to the games. What's it going to take to put you, how much stronger would you have to be? I don't remember Sam's numbers offhand. Do any of you guys know like what roughly her max snatch is? It's in the, I don't know.
Snatch is about 180.
Right. Okay. So that's obviously very good, but it's not what the top level females at the games are doing anymore. What's it going to take to put 20 more pounds on that snatch, 25 more pounds? That's significant. That's a big improvement. So yeah, I think you have to know when to make that call and say, the cost is too high. We are going to have to sacrifice things that are, if you can think of CrossFitness, right? The thing that CrossFit tests, you've got to recognize that it is sort of built up of all these different capacities. And for each athlete, it's going to be built in slightly different ways. And the absolute best athletes, the athletes who consistently top 5 podium win the games, are going to be the ones who have the ability to build that CrossFitness pretty evenly across the board and at a very high level. They're few and far between. Over time, we'll probably see more of them, but that's what the very, very best that's what the very best CrossFit athletes are. They don't have meaningful weaknesses.
So Jacob, you started to talk about this idea of balancing variance with repetition, right? Which is like kind of where the questions I was originally asking were leading. And we read one of your blog posts on emerging strategies for coaching fitness competitors, and you started to outline that concept a little bit. We'll link to this post in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to read it. But can you sort of explicitly explain what you mean with that emerging strategies concept?
Yeah, I should first highlight emerging strategies is a concept I wouldn't say borrowed so much as stolen outright from Mike Tuchscherer, Reactive Training Systems, one of the best powerlifters and powerlifting coaches out there. So definitely, especially if you are a coach, Mike's stuff is invaluable. Go check it out. Emerging strategies basically is the idea that you develop an athlete's training over time by paying attention to what's going on in their training as it happens. So that's not to suggest you don't do any kind of long-term planning. The way I tend to do it is I have a broad training structure, right? We have usually, like I mentioned, a 2-week microcycle, so an A week and a B week. And you obviously have particular adaptations in mind. And basically, I write the workouts. So let's say the workout is back squatting a set of 5 with 2 reps in the tank. We'll come back to that workout for multiple iterations, maybe every week, maybe every second week, and I won't make a change until there is some clear reason to make a change. Now, I should note, sometimes an athlete telling me, I'm very bored, is a reason. But let's talk about sort of physiological reasons. So if an athlete is progressing, if they're adding a few kilos to their set of 5 with 2 reps in the tank every iteration, there's not any good reason, really, not any independently good reason for me to change that. And I think that notion is sort of at the core of this emerging strategies approach to training. The idea that if the athlete is progressing, that is sufficient evidence that the training is working and there's not an obvious reason to change it. So what that manifests as for my competitors, I think I'll talk about the way I design mixed workouts, like CrossFit workouts specifically. We can talk about how it looks with strength training as well, but I think that's a lot more. There's plenty of people doing that. So I should first mention briefly the sort of model I use for CrossFit training design. This is not something I've always used. I picked it up over the last several years by talking a lot with Evan Picon, who I don't know if he still is, but at least was for quite a period of time, like the head sports scientist at Training Think Tank. Really smart guy, does great work. And Evan has a model of bioenergetics based on oxygen kinetics, based on essentially trying to determine what is limiting the athlete's ability to endure. And he breaks it down into 3 potential major limiters: the delivery of oxygen, so the athlete's ability to successfully get blood and oxygen into working muscles; the respiratory intake of oxygen, so the athlete's ability to take oxygen in from their surroundings; and the utilization of oxygen. So once the oxygen is in the body and has been delivered to the muscles, how effective are you at utilizing it? Roughly speaking, those 3 categories correlate to things we typically would call like aerobic fitness, lactate threshold, VO2 max, and anaerobic fitness. So I design workouts. We can get into it if it's the details if relevant, but basically I design workouts with those adaptations in mind. I try to design them thinking, is this a delivery workout, a respiratory workout, or a utilization workout? And generally speaking, the athlete will repeat that workout until I'm presented with a reason to make a change. I typically, because it's CrossFit and because I know that CrossFit athletes enjoy variance, it's kind of like, it's weird if you're a CrossFitter. I usually don't do more than about 3 or 4 iterations of a given workout, and that can take a few different forms. So I'll give you an example of a workout I commonly do. We will take a 20-minute EMOM. The first minute, the athlete will do like AMRAP style, but at a prescribed RPE, usually at about an 8 out of 10 difficulty. So hard but sustainable. Usually using small sets or small reps. So it would be, think something like 1 minute alternating rounds of 3 thrusters with 50-pound dumbbells, 3 burpees, 3 pull-ups. Work for the minute, and then do some kind of cyclical movement, like let's say biking, at a slightly lower intensity. So let's say a 7 out of 10 for 1 minute. And repeat that back and forth for 20 minutes. That is a delivery workout. And what will happen from there is one of a few things. One is I'll just keep it. We'll do exactly the same thing. Another is we'll look to increase the volumes. We'll go from EMOM 20 to EMOM 24 to EMOM 28. And a third option is to convert that workout into something more intense to turn it into a respiratory workout. And typically the way I'll do it with that particular workout is we'll take the working period for the circuit to 2 minutes. We'll keep the bike at 1 minute. So 2-to-1 ratio of the circuit to the cyclical work. We'll do that 3 times in a row, rest 4 minutes, and repeat. And basically what I'm doing there, the way I'm deciding what change I'm going to make there is based on what I think the athlete is limited by. So if an athlete is limited by their delivery, in my estimation, I'm probably going to increase the volume because I don't want to make it a much more intense workout where they're now going to be limited by their ability to take oxygen in. I instead want to make sure we're spending an extended period of time delivering oxygen, training that capacity. If I think the athlete is limited by their respiratory fitness, then I'm gonna build the intensity up, and we're gonna look to get into that domain. But the question ends up being, I shouldn't say the question. My mantra is make changes for reasons, right? I think that the risk with variance is not understanding that yes, variance is required. It's the nature of the sport. However, you need to call it rational variance. It has to be variance within sort of a system with particular targets. So I think the key generally, like, you don't have to use that specific model. I think the way to approach it is to understand everything you program should have a goal. That goal should be, in my opinion, should be described in terms of adaptations. There's a little bit of room to think about things differently as we get close to competition. But generally speaking, training should be designed in terms of adaptation. And you progress the training rationally by understanding what you need to do in order to facilitate further growth of that adaptation. The variance comes from the having a bunch of different workouts that you do, but it doesn't mean that every workout for each particular adaptation needs to be different all the time. I think probably that's gonna it can work, but the big problem for me has been it makes the training process opaque. It's hard to see what's going on. You need legibility into your athlete's training. You need to be able to look at their training log and make rational inferences about what you see. And in order to do that, you need enough repetition to see, repetition is not even the best word for it. Let's use the word iteration. You need iteration in order to understand what your next step should be.
Totally. That's a super interesting model. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. So I appreciate the actual specific example, because I think that makes it tangible for people, right? You can sort of think about like, okay, yeah, I'm doing this mixed circuit, then going into some lower intensity cyclical piece and kind of bouncing back and forth between that. Like most people listening to this podcast, are either athletes or coaches who have done something like that or programmed something like that. So I think there is some just broad intuition for what that potentially feels like. So to kind of ask another like philosophical question about your training style here, 2 common failure modes for prescribing training in the CrossFit space are the like decompose everything and try to like build the sport from individual components, which tends to not work at all, right? So we've talked about this previously on other podcasts where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, like we want to get you better at thrusters and pull-ups. So we can think about like really improving your structural balance side to side on your hips. So we're going to do like a bunch of like single leg raises and like hip airplanes and banded stuff, which like, yeah, sure, there's value to that, and then we want to make sure that you have like great, lat motor control and shoulder mechanics. We're going to do like bottoms up carries and single arm banded pull downs. And then we'll do strict presses to improve your overhead capacity. And like, we're trying to build each of these pieces. And then as soon as you actually do like a literal thruster, you're like puking your guts out because you have no capacity for the actual sport, right? So you can't take the individual components and turn that into the sport. Doesn't work, right? And then the other failure mode is like, just do everything all the time, total chaos, which actually a lot of the elites training looks like that. So people get easily fooled because they're like, oh, well, this is what, Medeiros is doing. And it's like, yeah, because he's a goddamn fucking freak and can just adapt to everything all at once, which doesn't mean you can just port that onto your, like half the genetic capacity, half the training age, half the recovery infrastructure involved in that. it's going to tear you apart. So what you're describing is something in between those, which is like, we're going to actually try to take components of the sport rather than like break apart the sport, but make it very like repetitive and deliberate to try to progress it from there. Is that like a somewhat accurate framing of what you're doing?
Yes, it is. And I think the other element of it that's really important, that's something I've struggled with for years, and I still don't have, to be clear, an answer to this in terms of, what is physiologically going on. But, I think that what I have developed over the years is a way to target adaptations. You need to think, you don't need, like, I am not a sport physiologist. I do not know the granular details of these physiological adaptations, but you need to have enough of an understanding of what is going on. And this is part of why, it's not the only reason why, but it is part of why I was so attracted to the model I described that Evan and Training Think Tank have developed, is because it makes it pretty straightforward. It makes it straightforward to understand what you're programming towards. And it's pretty easy to develop guidelines for actual workout design that will help you design workouts that way. So yes, I'd say it's both that. It is that sort of the combination of, like I said, rational variance. Yes, we need variance. Yes, we need to do a lot of stuff, but we need legibility. We need iteration. So let's organize these things in such a way that we can see progress happening if it is indeed happening, and know that we need to make a change if it's not. And at the same time, it's important to have some model for understanding what kind of adaptations you're targeting. It doesn't have to be perfect. Physiological adaptations, physiological characteristics are fuzzy and blurry. We describe them in these sort of isolated ways because we need sensible ways to talk about them. But ultimately, all of these processes are inextricably bound up with one another. So you don't need like a perfect granular sport physiological understanding of the adaptations, but you need some kind of rational model that allows you to have that legibility, to have an idea of what's going on with the athlete's training, and to make rational inferences about what you should do next. So it's that combination of rationalizing, taking the components of the sport and training them deliberately, and training them in a way that at least aims at particular adaptations.
Yeah, so I think what you're describing is like, how do we actually get at creating this physiological adaptation in a reasonable, progressive way, which is challenging given the demands of the sport. And so I think we can use maybe like open repeats as an example for what might be going on with some people and why it's difficult to actually get true physiological adaptation, right? So I think everyone here has repeated open workouts or coached people who repeat open workouts. And like, even for relatively high level athletes, you can get like a 20% improvement on your score in an open workout 2 days later, which is like outrageous, right? Where you're like, your first score was like really okay, and you somehow got like 2 more full rounds, which is like, what actually happened there. And so clearly the original stimulus, was not like true physical capacity for that athlete. Like it may have been, they may have actually, pushed to some sort of threshold, to use Evan's example, right? Maybe they occluded somewhere, which, spiked their RPE. They're unable to deliver oxygen to the working muscle. And like, yes, they were at like a true max effort for them in that scenario. But in terms of their potential performance, they were nowhere close to it. But by repeating this stimulus over and over again, you're actually facilitating that athlete digging further into their peak physical potential on the task you're giving them, which, in some zoomed out sense, like does make sense that might actually get further into like digging out the physiological adaptation you're trying to achieve, as opposed to just that athlete learning both consciously and subconsciously, like, how should I approach this workout? When is this going to get difficult? How should I fraction my reps? And not just blowing up on it early because they miscalculated, or they don't have the sort of like subconscious intuitive capacity to pace it correctly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, imagine you've never run a 400 meter max effort, and I had you run one on Friday and another on Monday. You're going to run faster on Monday. And it's not because you got fitter. It's because you now understand, oh my God, I was blown out at 250 meters. I need a pace. So that's what's going on, I think, with open workouts in particular. It's not so much physiological adaptation. It's that the athlete learns, whether explicitly or intuitively, how to manage their resources better across the course of the workout. And I think that actually brings me to kind of another point about workout design, which is I think it's really valuable to be explicit in what you want the athlete to do. I used to shy away from using sort of extensive language, and I still try to be concise. It's important to be concise, but I used to have this sort of obsession with formulating everything. So to give an example from strength training, I would write workouts like 5 at 2, 2 reps in reserve, fatigue stop at 1. And I still do that. But I'm also much more prone now to just honestly writing workouts the way CrossFit HQ, CrossFit.com used to write a lot of them, where I just say, work up to a set of 5 that you think you could do 2 more with. Do that weight for 2 more sets of 5, right? It's the same thing, but what I want to get at there is that you can shortcut a lot of the pacing mistakes an athlete will make by using your language clearly, telling them, this is how I want you to approach the workout, this is what it should feel like, etc. You can also avoid a lot of those mistakes by using, basically, like, I distinguish between gamified and non-gamified workouts. So a gamified workout is like for time, AMRAP. A non-gamified workout is one where the work is, in a sense, prescribed entirely. So to go back to that example that I talked about earlier with the 20-minute alternating EMOM, the work isn't exactly prescribed, right? Because you're going to end up at the end with basically 2 scores, quote unquote scores. One is going to be the total number of rounds you completed on the circuit. So I usually have people score it continuously. So they end up with a number as though it was just a 10-minute AMRAP. And they're going to have an average wattage on the bike, or a rough average wattage on the bike. But by using that EMOM format and telling them, hey, take this at a RPE 8 on the circuit and a RPE 7 on the bike, and by telling them it should feel like hard work, but your breathing should be under control the whole time and your rounds should be pretty consistent, you can skip right past the first iteration where, just like with the first iteration of an open workout, you just don't know what to expect. On that same line, I think it's really valuable to, when you do make changes, they could just be small changes. You don't need to upend everything. You know, progressing that workout could be as simple as adding 2 to 4 minutes, adding a couple of rounds, or it could be as simple as adding 1 rep to each movement. So I think that's another important point, that if you make big changes or you make a lot of changes at once, it's hard to know, just as an epistemic problem, as a problem of knowledge. It's difficult to know what's going on. If you make small changes with each iteration, you're going to be able to tell much more clearly whether the training is going in the direction that you want it to go.
Jacob, do you think there's sort of value in letting athletes just build experience by doing, say, just sort of random CrossFit? And I suppose where I'm coming at is because I think I keep on going back and forth about the sort of how you should program for someone who is more of a beginner getting into competitive CrossFit versus someone who has been in the sport for a while. And I suppose the thing I'll go back and forth with is, before I was thinking, okay, this person is a beginner, they need a lot of structure and they need to have things set out in a way where they sort of learn how to train. But part of CrossFit is also learning how to deal with the, dealing with the workouts and going through sort of those pacing errors and sort of going, like, cutting your teeth like that. So I suppose, before I was sort of, okay, start a lot more structured and then build into more sports play, sports practice, as it were. Part of me does feel that it could work also the other way around. And I sort of think back to when I started CrossFit, and when I know a lot of, probably all of us started CrossFit, we were just doing lots of CrossFit and we were learning a lot about it. And then maybe as we progressed more, we were getting a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more structured in our training. And then that sort of allows you to sort of hone in. So I suppose my question is sort of, do you think it's valuable for people to just have exposure to just practicing the sport in a little bit of a chaotic way? Or, would you also, from sort of legibility of the training, does that make it quite difficult for you to have that legibility and then be able to sort of progress it in a direction that you want it?
So I think there's two different tracks on which we can answer this question. One is a question about what is the most effective training to get the adaptations that we want? And the other is like, what does the athlete as a human being need in terms of, number one, like you said, you need to learn how to deal with the unpredictability and the newness and that kind of stuff. And also just like people need to like their training. That is an underrated concept. You will not, I repeat, you will not produce an elite competitor if they hate their training all the time. It just won't happen. Sometimes you're going to have to do stuff you don't like. That's unavoidable. But if you hate your training all the time, if it's not interesting, if it's boring, you're either going to find a new coach or you're going to quit because you're a human. So there's that aspect to it. And on that front, yes, there's definitely value to doing things like that. The answer is likewise yes, in terms of physiological adaptation, because I think two things here. One, CrossFit is a sport that demands a lot of intensity, so it makes sense to do high-intensity workouts. But also, I guess what I want to say is that in both cases, whether we're talking about in terms of developing the athlete as a human being, in terms of keeping them in the training process and making sure it's sufficiently enjoyable, and in terms of developing that capacity to show up on game day, be intense when you need to be intense, be smart and kind of tactical when you need to be able to adapt to random varied movements that you've never done. In either of those cases, none of the fact that we need to do that does not imply that we can't do that in and of itself in a rational way. So there's at least two different ways that we can, I think, do that. One is just because a workout is gamified, just because a workout is a, quote unquote WOD, is 4-time AMRAP, doesn't mean we can't at least try to target specific adaptations and to situate it in a context that makes sense, right? So for example, I might just say on Fridays, we're going to do a really high intensity gamified piece. And I'm going to then say, all right, well, I'm going to try to design it to be a respiratory stimulus. And the athlete might never know. The workout might be, for time, 500 meter row, 20 thrusters with 95 pounds, 20 burpees, 500 meter row. The athlete might not know that's a respiratory stimulus. But if I tell them to pace it appropriately, to go really hard, it's still going to be, again, these adaptations in general are fuzzy, and especially with CrossFit workouts, they're fuzzy. But you can at least try to be within some kind of particular adaptive domain. And you can also set up the athlete for success by not just doing it randomly. So let's say you wanted to have an athlete have an experience with doing 6 workouts in 3 days and not knowing what's coming next. Well, you can pick a weekend and say, we are going to do on this weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you're going to do 2 workouts each day. And I'm not going to tell you what the workouts are until half an hour before you do them. So the answer is yes, that kind of stuff can have value. I think what the value is particular to the individual. And I also think that it can be done in a way that makes sense, that is rational and fits into a well thought out model of training. Variance does not have to mean random or chaotic. It just has to mean varied.
So I have a bunch of thoughts that I will try to compress into a statement and a question, and apologies in advance if it gets a little bit wild. So I think that what you're talking about makes a lot of sense as far as trying to handle the challenges of creating physiological adaptation in a messy environment. And then also, like you said, actually forcing athletes to potentially execute something in a way that actually makes sense, right? Because I think that's an underrated aspect of being prescriptive and progressive in training, is that some percentage of athletes will just figure out what they're supposed to do and basically do it correctly, but a surprising amount won't, especially at the sub-elite level. So if you're just hey, yeah, you got thrusters and pull-ups, and then you're going to ride the bike for a little bit, do that for whatever EMOM structure you described. A lot of people will just really mess that up and not get the right stimulus out of it. And then if they have an opportunity to do it again and again and again, it might take them 4 tries to actually learn the appropriate lesson from it, right? Whereas someone who's at an elite level might just see that once, start it off, adjust on the fly without even realizing what they're doing, and basically do it correctly. Right. So I think that a steel man case for this like repetitive situation is, hey, like you're actually giving someone the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and do it again, and then learn from their mistakes and do it again until they finally internalize the lesson of like, okay, this is like the cycle time I need, this is the rest time I need, this is how I should fraction my sets so that I can in fact repeat this the number of times that I've been prescribed. Right. And maybe a potential point of disagreement here, though, is that as far as transference goes, I think that there's sort of what Luke was getting at. There's value in giving people more chaotic situations so that they can learn to transfer the things that they're picking up in training to other situations, right? So I've used a music analogy for this before, where one of the best ways to get transference to like other activities while playing an instrument is in fact to improvise, right? So, and apologies for the construction noise going on as well, right? But when you are improvising, you are forced to adapt on the fly, which then actually makes you better at like playing specific scales or like specific riffs that you're working on, much more so than the other way, right? Like you can practice the scale over and over again. There's a lot of value in like knowing your scales and hitting that specific thing. Like, okay, I'm doing this scale again. I'm doing this exact riff again. But then that doesn't necessarily give you the ability to improvise in the same way that when you improvise and then you need to go and play your scale, you're like, oh, like my picking pattern is much better on the guitar. Like I have a much better intuitive feel of how the instrument even functions. So finding that balance between like progressing people on the same thing over and over again to allow them to internalize lessons and actually learn them appropriately. And like you said, get the physiological adaptation, like huge. But simultaneously, if they aren't exposed to enough like chaos where they have to then like take the things that they've learned and apply it to an actual situation, I think that can be an, like, let's say a negative to their overall ability to transfer things. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think what I would want to say is just that the fact that you are doing something that is, as you will put it, chaotic or non-iterative, the fact that you're not going to repeat this just doesn't mean that you can't be sensible about how you situate it in the training. So in other words, just because we're only doing a workout once doesn't mean I, as the coach, can't say, I want to target a respiratory stimulus. Doesn't change anything for the athlete, right? So just because just because we're not doing the workout again doesn't mean that I can't choose where to do it, when to do it, etc. So of course, it's about striking that balance. And yeah, I do think there is value, although I will hedge by saying the value of that kind of thing is extremely contingent on the particular athlete. Some athletes, they just deal with chaos, man. Some athletes it just doesn't bother them. Some athletes, they just figure it out on the go. And for those people, you're probably going to get less value out of doing that in training. And for people who really struggle with that, everybody has seen those people who, like, you put them in the gym and they just crush it. Their performance is incredible, and they get there on game day, and whatever it is about game day gets to them, they're going to get more value out of that. But so I don't think there's a point of disagreement at all. I think I would just want to add, when you do that, I think it's easy to use the desire to write that kind of training for an athlete as an excuse to not think it through and to not think about, when should we do this? How should we do it? What should my instructions to the athlete be, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the kind of thing I would want to avoid. But undoubtedly, CrossFit is a chaotic sport. So you have to work enough of that in that the particular athlete gets the kind of sport-specific sort of exposure they need. And that'll actually, a point to make there is I briefly mentioned earlier that I think there is some space for thinking about workouts in a non-adaptive sense, thinking about other things. So the other things would be sport specificity. So to give an example from like a cyclical sport, let's say you have a rower. I think most of the time, well, I won't say most of the time because I don't know much about most rowers training, but one approach I've seen is that for a lot of an athlete's training, a rower, their training is going to be adaptation focused. They're doing their, aerobic workouts, their power workouts, whatever. But as you get closer to a race, you will switch to workouts where what you're doing is targeting a specific pace. Well, what is that? That's sport specific training. That's saying I've got a 2K, and I know this is my previous 2K. And it's certainly true that we could take a guess. We could say, the athlete is probably getting a respiratory stimulus from this, or whatever it happens to be. But that's not the criteria we used to design the workout. The criteria we used was the target pace. So I certainly think there's room to say, well, the purpose of this workout isn't a certain adaptation. The purpose of this workout is practicing the sport. And I think that's kind of, that hovers around the kind of thing you're saying. And all I'd want to say on top of it is we can be thoughtful and we can be rational about how we do that.
So maybe a question that might be helpful for people listening and thinking about, like, how can I apply this? So let's say you have, for an athlete, like 5 training sessions that they do in a week that may have multiple parts to them. How many sessions or parts of sessions are going to be, let's say, in this more like repetitive week-to-week model where they're doing something very similar, and how many of them are going to be a little bit more like on-the-fly, chaotic, whatever?
It depends a lot on both the athlete and where we're at in their training. I would say, though, frankly, probably like 90% of their training volume with my athletes tends to be iterative. Again, for reasons of both legibility and the ability to just clearly, obviously make progress on something. That might change with an athlete who I know or I suspect needs more of that kind of like sport-specific practice. It also changes as we get closer to competition, because if we are 4 weeks out, then what we need to be doing to some large extent is to be practicing the sport. That said, even as we prepare for competition, I still need to ensure that the athlete is getting or maintaining the adaptations we need. And it's difficult to do that from an epistemic point of view, from the question of knowing what's going on. It's difficult to do that absent iteration. But I would say most of the time, my athletes are mostly doing pretty iterative training.
Jacob, where would you start with an athlete? I do remember listening to yourself and Mike talk on the RTS podcast about it starting more with like with powerlifters, like, you would start off with a super basic structure and then you would just sort of build from there based off of the athlete response. Now, given that in CrossFit there's so much going on, you sort of alluded to it already with you're working off of basically a 2-week split. But sort of like, what are some of the key things that you're not necessarily looking to test, but looking for the athlete to sort of express in their training so that you can then assess what potentially needs to be driven in sort of what direction?
So assuming that I have what I deem to be sufficient knowledge of the athlete's capacity, I'll focus my response here on like endurance / CrossFit type stuff, not strength per se. What I want to know, I want to have a picture of where the athlete falls on a spectrum of limitation on that delivery respiratory utilization model. And then what I'm looking to do is basically determine in the period of a microcycle, let's say 2 weeks, how many times do I want to train their specific limiter? Usually going to be about twice a week, something like that. So if an athlete's respiratory limited, I want to make sure that they're getting at least 2 respiratory training sessions per week. I want to make sure that their other workouts, that all of their other training basically does 2 things, that it both is sufficiently broad, that we are supporting the broad adaptive domains needed for CrossFit, and that it's facilitating them making progress in their weakest areas. Evan gives this great example when he talks, I'm sure you can find like YouTube videos of him talking about this. When he talks about training design, essentially, he gives the example of if you have a factory that makes toy cars, and it's got 3 stations. The first station assembles the chassis, and the second station puts the body on the car, and the third station paints the car. If you decide, I want to double our production, if you increase the amount of resources at each of those 3 stations equally, but it turns out that the second station is the holdup for everything, you're not going to increase your capacity, you're not going to increase your production meaningfully. So you have to determine, we've got finite resources to distribute, how do I distribute them? And like I said, I think that for me, it's usually, at least in the case of respiratory fitness, it's like 2, maybe 3 in some cases workouts per week, and the rest of the training is designed to facilitate that while also ensuring that we get enough work on the other things. So in like a 2-week microcycle, let's say we're doing 3 respiratory sessions a week. I might want to say we also want to do 2 delivery sessions in 1 week, and the other week 1 delivery session and 1 utilization session, or something along those lines. But it's basically just about figuring out what is the athlete limited by, how frequently should we train it. How frequently we should train it is dependent on a lot of specifics. I mean, if you're limited by utilization, especially if you're in like the kind of gray zone between utilization and respiratory, the workouts to develop that are very, very taxing. Whereas if you're limited by your delivery, you could probably do that 4 or 5 times a week, some kind of delivery work, and be okay. But that's the approach I take. Figure out what I think the athlete is limited by, design the training to emphasize that, and have some kind of regularity, whether in training itself or through distinct testing phases, to let me know if we're on the right track.
So something that I'm curious about with giving people similar workouts every week and having them, attempt to progress, is that a lot of athletes are very tied to their day-to-day performance and have a relatively poor understanding of the amount of like expected variance in day-to-day performance, especially within CrossFit. I'm not sure how much this is a thing with other sports like powerlifting or track, or you mentioned rowing or whatever. And from some interaction with those athletes and some experience with some of those folks, I think it's like a little bit less psycho there, because they are just doing the same thing over and over again. They recognize like, oh yeah, some days my squat is in fact just like 35 pounds lower than normal, and that's not the end of the world. But if that happens to a lot of CrossFit athletes, like it's over, right? We got tiers, we have messages being sent, we have coaching changes considered, like all kinds of things just like start completely falling apart when people perform much worse than they normally do on something. And if you are giving people this similar structured training over and over and over again, do they in fact learn like, hey, there's actually a pretty good amount of variance week to week? Or do they have sort of like meltdowns every time? It's like, oh God, I did worse than last week. Like I'm screwed. My season's over. I need a different coach. Like this isn't going well.
Yeah, so I think a few different things. The first one I should mention is I've got a selection bias. I take on clients who are comfortable with that. When I take a new client on, when we talk, I tell them, expect to repeat stuff a lot. And if you're not okay with that, we probably won't work together all that well. The second thing is education. I think a critical component. If you're serious about developing good athletes are smart. Your job as a coach you are not the driver, man. You cannot be the driver. You are the bumpers on the bowling lane. You can keep the athlete on track, but they're the source of momentum. So you have to be part of educating them, getting them to understand why they're doing, what the goal is, how you're trying to make them better. I think a lot of young coaches, especially, I was certainly like this when I was a little bit younger. It's really easy to feel like you don't want to explain yourself, because especially if you're still figuring things out, you're still new, you don't have really clear, articulate answers for everything, which nobody does when they're new. That's fine. But you can feel like the athlete is questioning you. Don't do that. What you want to do is be explicit with the athlete about why you're making the decisions you're making, help them understand, and that is going to be the best thing you as a coach can do in order to avoid that kind of thing. It's imperfect. People are still going to have those responses, but that helps a lot. Lastly, I think what I want to say is when you do this, you might be surprised at how much day-to-day performance actually evens out. It gets pretty consistent. And I think the reason for that is that the athlete, part of the downside of not doing a bunch of iteration is that the athlete doesn't get an intimate knowledge of their own capacity. So with endurance athletes, for example, I think that there is a lot less of that. But part of the reason that there's a lot less of that kind of response is because they know what they can do and how to approach each workout. So, and another big part of the reason, in my opinion, with CrossFitters in particular, and I think this is getting to be less and less the case with competitors. I think by and large, competitors these days train in a way that's pretty rational, but you see it all the time with CrossFit gyms. if you try to be at a 10 all of the time, 10 out of 10 intensity, you're actually always going to be at a 7, right? So when you organize the training rationally, where you have hard workouts, easier workouts, etc., and the athlete knows what they're supposed to be doing in each case, you can actually stabilize performance a lot, because the athlete will be ready for that hard session on Friday because they took a relatively easy day on Thursday. So I guess it's those three things. I have a selection bias. I place a high emphasis on athlete education, on getting them to understand what we're doing and why. And by structuring the training week sensibly, I think you can actually stabilize performance quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's something else that tends to happen for athletes as they kind of like repeat things, and we started to touch on this a little bit, is that there's sort of like predictions, like their internal subconscious predictions of how difficult something is going to feel become calibrated more properly.
Absolutely.
Right. And if your prediction of how difficult something is going to be is way off, like that in and of itself generates a massive amount of fatigue, right? That just like being wrong, like on a subconscious level, makes people get extremely tired very quickly. And so I think that one of the things that separates very good athletes from athletes at like whatever the level is below them is that people who are better have this better intuitive capacity to predict appropriately, like how hard something is going to feel for them, so they don't get that sudden spike in RPE when they're like, oh shit, like this is actually hard and I thought it was going to feel like this. And you know, again, we just talked about open workouts. You see that all the time in the open, where you're like, okay, yeah, I watched the elite athletes do it. I'm going to be a little bit slower than them, but I should be able to get this many rounds, and I'll pace it from the start, so it won't be that hard. And then, you know, the wall climb, dumbbell snatch, box jump over workout is, people are like, yeah, okay, so the elite's got like, 10, 11 rounds. Some people are higher on the leaderboard. Like I could probably get 10-ish, I'll go a little slower. I'll pace it out the gate. First 4 rounds will be pretty easy. And it's like, it's not easy. Like you can pace it out the gate and it's going to be hard. And then as soon as, you start your 3rd round of wall climbs, you're like, uh-oh, this is hard. Your subconscious prediction of what it was going to feel like was way off. And you're, it's a bloodbath the rest of the workout. You're done.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think a big part of it is people conflate the idea of like, I paced something with, or I'm going to pace this with, it's not going to be hard. Your pace doesn't mean it's easy. Your pace means it's rational. It means that you are thinking about what is the level of output I can sustain. Well, let me tell you, if you do a 20-minute power test on the bike and you nail the pacing, it will hurt like hell, because nailing the pacing means you were at the limit of your ability to sustain the output. So I think that's absolutely right. And when you mispace something, now you're in this situation where elevated heart rate, elevated respiratory rate, and you're charged with, I got to figure out what to do now. And that will ruin your day. So I think that's absolutely right. And that, again, it goes back to like, well, why don't endurance athletes seem to have the same kind of variance in performance that CrossFit athletes do? And a big part of the reason is that endurance sport, man, pacing is the game. And they're incredible at it. I always forget their names, but there were these rowers I used to follow on Instagram. There were twins from like, I don't know, somewhere in the Scandinavian countries. And I remember looking at their workouts, and the precision was just absurd, where they would like row 4x2K in some frankly offensively fast time. And all 4 of them would be within like a 1/10 of a second of each other. That's crazy. That's nuts, right? But it really goes to show that like the ability to pace, it doesn't mean it's easy. It means that you have a reasonable expectation of what you're going to do and what it's going to feel like. And, we fear the unknown. But when you go in with a clearer sense and really a clearer ability to understand what is going to happen in the course of the workout, you're going to perform better.
I think,
so
yeah.
Jacob, I mean,
I get that quite a lot. All right. I was just going to say, like, I think because for CrossFitters, a lot of the pacing initially is about teaching them basically just not to do what, Jason Kalipa used to do in workouts. And then people end up taking things way too easy. And then when you're actually like giving them, okay, like you're like, okay, well, you need to slow down so you can actually become consistent in the first place. And then you actually need to really start to express your paces and stuff like that. And it's, like you see people constantly trying to, we were talking about, I think on the last podcast, where, we're talking about sort of just the ability to go off pace and be able to actually push. Like if you're super consistent across the board, then you probably left something in the tank. But that pacing awareness, I think, is something that a lot of CrossFitters it's just to stop them from blowing up in the middle of after 2 minutes of the workout.
Yeah, I mean, pacing is a skill. So there's going to be phases of development. And I think you're right. Early on, it's just about like getting people to not crash and burn. And then over time, you develop the ability to kick, right? You develop the ability to know or to get, have a clearer picture of at what point or points in this workout should I turn the intensity up. Sean Sweeney, who's the highest level athlete I've coached, that was one of his best skills, is that he was just really good. You can watch his performances from a lot of regionals, and like in workouts that he ends up winning or being in the top 3, he'll spend most of the workout mid-pack, but always close enough that when he's ready, he could put the hammer down and pull ahead. And that is a trainable skill. And I think you're right, Luke, that essentially assuming, some people are just good at it. Some people are just naturally like, especially if they have an endurance background, they're going to grok it more quickly, more readily. But it is something you can develop. And that kind of first phase is just, how do I get this person to not blow up? And then over time, they develop this kind of sense of what's going to happen if I put the hammer down at point A, point B, and point C. And once they have that, you're going to start seeing much better performances. And interestingly, this kind of comes back to the question of repetition, iteration versus variance, because in order to really develop that skill, you need both. You need to have iteration because that is going to build the familiarity with your capacity, but you also need variance because that's going to put you into situations where you can put your knowledge to the test and ask yourself, do I really know what my capacity is? And the only way to do that is to try something you haven't tried before and test your hypothesis, as it were.
Totally. Yeah. There's I think all of us are sort of touching on the same thing, which is like, there's this learning curve where initially people just kind of like go out hot and hope to hang on. And then they learn like, okay, maybe that's not the best strategy. And then they have to relearn like, it's all right to suffer a little bit, but you just have to be tactical with how you're suffering.
Tactical suffering. That's exactly right. I like that.
Totally. So Jacob, what are you excited about with training currently? What cutting edge methods, what new forms of repetition and variance are you playing with right now?
Man, it would be hard for me to nail down anything too specific. I'm always the thing that I've come to love more than anything, maybe because I struggled with it for so long. I love designing mixed workouts in a way that I think fits this model, that is rational, that targets a particular adaptation. So I have I have basically a spreadsheet that has a bunch of different workout forms. So the one I described earlier, the EMOM 20, that's directly from Evan. He calls those alternation intervals. But basically, I have a bunch of different workout formats, and I really like to come up with variations on and progressions to those formats. That's something I really enjoy doing, partially because I feel like up until just a few years ago, it's something I really struggled with where, it always kind of felt just a little too random for my liking. But having a much clearer sense of how to do that, that's something I really, really enjoy doing. I would struggle to give you a very specific example of that. Stuff I've been digging lately, I was playing with the knees over toes guy stuff for a while, and I got a lot out of that. I don't know that I necessarily would feel the need to tell somebody to do his exact programs. I mean, give it a try if you want to. It's actually, I think it's a really good deal. It's like $50 a month, and they give you actual coaching. It's pretty cool. But just that concept of strengthening people in really large ranges of motion, that's obviously got carryover to jiu-jitsu, which is my main athletic endeavor personally. So I've been enjoying stuff like that. Over last summer, I spent a lot of time. We were still in pod training for jiu-jitsu when stuff was still closed up. So basically where I only had 1 or 2 training partners, the same people all the time. And I spent some time developing kind of like jujitsu workouts where we would mix together live jujitsu training or specific training, various kinds of jujitsu training with either fitness training or movement drills, and kind of applying these same concepts to that kind of stuff. So I really loved that. I also teach jujitsu now, so that's my passion. I've been doing it for almost 7 years, very consistently, and coming up with like lesson plans, and that's something I really love doing. And more broadly, I've come to think about training. The thing that I love about training these days is treating it as a craft and bringing that to people and making it, I think that having a craft to hone will keep you from going insane in an insane world. And training is that craft for me. And the thing I love more than anything these days is like helping people make training a craft for them, both because it improves their physical health, but also because it gives you a sense of empowerment and enjoyment and something to focus on and improve at. And that's something that I find really, really appealing.
You gonna let anyone see that workout spreadsheet?
Yeah, I mean, I can send it. It's not actually a spreadsheet. It's actually in TrueCoach, but I can send you. Like, I'm a great believer in open source, so I'm happy to give all this stuff to whoever.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to post that somewhere on your site too, we could link it in the podcast notes. Since I think anyone who listened this far would probably be like, yeah, I'll look at that.
I would need some time, but I would happily throw together a spreadsheet with like some examples.
Like that.
bunch of nerds. I could definitely throw something together.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I think folks would get value out of that, right? Because I mean, we did talk some specifics, but a relatively philosophical conversation. And I think sometimes just literally seeing like EMOM 20 minute 4 do this, like people are like, okay, yeah, like that actually makes a little bit more sense now. So I think a lot of people would get value out of that.
We can definitely do that. That'd be fun.
Yeah. Jacob, you have your website. Do you want coaching clients? Do you want people to read your old blogs? What a man of extreme marketing prowess such as yourself, what do you want people to do if they want to learn more?
If you want to talk to me, the website is Anarchos. That's ANARCHOS trainingmethods.com. There's a contact form on there and a little bit of writing. I have a very ill-maintained blog, exercisephilosophy.com. I reserve the right to disavow anything that past Jacob said, but hopefully none of it is too stupid. I'm always looking for coaching clients. I have a selection bias, so I'm always going to want to talk to people and see if we're a good fit. But if you heard something today that made you think it's an interesting prospect, anarchostrainingmethods.com. Just drop me a line from the contact form, and always happy to talk.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.